Good afternoon, Donna, and I would like to just warmly welcome you to Wellbeing in Schools Australia. We have worked together now for a couple of decades, and you have been a fabulous supporter of Wellbeing in Schools Australia. Attend next year. So thank you, Donna. This topic today has been a big one that has consumed a lot of our efforts over that time. And before we move to that topic, I'd just like to stop and acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands of where we're meeting and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This topic today, Donna, is a hot one. We have extensively asked the question every time we run training. Can anybody tell us the most effective interventions? And I'm always gobsmacked by the deadly silence in the room that follows. So I'd like to say, over to you. You're the expert here. One of Australia's leading experts, along with Professor Ken Rigby, who's acknowledged both of you internationally in Australia as the leading academics and practitioners in this space. So thank you, Donna, for your time.
Thanks very much, Jack. I'll just share my screen so we can get started. And hello to everyone. The topic that I'd like to focus on today is obviously bullying, and to give you some insight into the latest data and the summary that I prepared for you. If you touch your screen, it'll sizzle because I only finished it last night with the most recent data that we have from around the world. It's kind of an evidence summary of what do we know now and how has that grown or changed over time. But before I get into this presentation, I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on. I'm on Noongar Whadjuk Budja here in Perth, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, as part of this presentation, you can see my topic of focus here, that what if harm from bullying is a hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Of course, terribly tongue-in-cheek, but very focused on, whatever we do to address bullying behaviour, we in fact make nicer classrooms, nicer schools. We help kids get along. We address all the issues that would just make spending time with people so much better. So whilst a lot of the recommendations from the research that I'll get to at the end are very helpful, if you look at them from the lens of how do we just make a really good school culture, how do we help people get along well with each other, how do we help people regulate their emotions, as you'll see, the science is just as strong that too, when you get that right, that makes an enormous difference to the levels of bullying behaviour within the school, the levels of upstander responses and so on. So I'm sure a lot of what I'll talk to today is just an affirmation of the great work that you're already doing, and maybe there's something in here that is new or at least updated from where you were before. As I've already mentioned, I'm just pausing here because my screen has frozen. There we go. There was some data some time ago, and because we're sort of just had the football grand final, I thought, show the MCG because get everyone in the zone. That every day, obviously, there are children who are bullied, and if you were to put all of those children into one place, they would fill the MCG. So it is an extremely prevalent behaviour. Now, some people would say it's prevalent because that word is used a lot and it has a lot of charge in it. Now, when you use the word bullying as against, just inappropriate behaviour or behaviour that is unpleasant, maybe there's a lot of over-reporting. But when we collect data, we always define what we mean by bullying first and then hope that children understand what's meant by that. But when we think about the prevalence, it is an extremely prevalent behaviour. So it's so important that we're setting up schools to be places that prevent this behaviour, and of course when it does occur that we've got good responses that are effective and don't take too much time to put in place as early intervention, or if children are fully engaged in the behaviour, what we can do to help them to change that behaviour over time. So the most recent data from meta-analyses, and you'll see this is 2014, I'm going to show you some more recent data since, but because this was a review of 72 international studies, so meta-analyses kind of pulls together all the best research. This is the most current meta-analyses that we have. And if you look internationally, we can see that just over a third of young people report being victimised. And as you can see here, slightly less, over a third report that they perpetrate bullying. And for both of these, this is at some point in their lives. So Madecki's systematic review is really interesting, but of course it's pre-COVID, and we know a lot changed with regard to bullying behaviour post-COVID. And we also know that there are certain groups who are much more likely to be targeted. So when we look at those data, that's an average, and an average is like having a fruit salad, but instead eating your fruit salad as a smoothie. So you don't get to taste all the bits that are in it. You kind of get this overall average. And as a researcher, averages are awful because you miss the importance of subgroups and what their particular needs are. And I don't think anybody watching would be surprised, as sad as it is, that children who fit these 5 criteria that I've listed here, neurodiverse, experiencing chronic conditions, maybe diabetes, I'm talking about chronic illnesses, LGBTQIA plus young people, obviously children who are different and are often targeted. And of course, that often captures children who might be described as ethnically diverse. And of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students report much higher levels of bullying. And in our Solid Kids, Solid Schools study, a very large study that was conducted and led by Julie Coffin, a Māori woman in Western Australia, amazing researcher herself, we found that not only prevalence levels higher, but the type of bullying that hurts Aboriginal children is different to the types of bullying that is not maybe not as hurtful, specifically in non-Aboriginal children. And maybe that's a question, if we get time to, I can provide more detail on that as we go through. So we look at, how common is bullying in Australia? The previous data were internationally, so that average of all of the data around the world from other prevalent studies. In Australia, in terms of victimisation, and these data come from Jadamba, and that research was completed in 2019, and there have been some other studies, but much smaller studies since. You can see that this piece of research put together 46 Australian studies. So we're looking at really, this is very robust data to kind of give us, are these data a pretty good sense of what's going on. So about a quarter of Australian children report that they are being bullied at least once last term. About 7% report that they are experiencing cyberbullying victimisation. So as part of that 25%, cyberbullying was included in that, but 7% of them were also or were experiencing cyberbullying. And as you can see here, those data also show that face-to-face bullying and cyberbullying victimisation were more common in younger children than older adolescents. And again, your group will no doubt know this, that at age 10, we see the highest levels of bullying, and then they decrease. And that's a developmental change that has contributed to that type of behaviour, with children starting to learn the power of the peer group. And then it increases again at transition to secondary schools. And our schools, of course, that it's the structure of schools that we break down relationship groups, and children need to kind of resort their social hierarchy. So we could change that second hike by how we support children through transition, for example, to keep those bullying levels down, and then they slowly decrease over time. But there's a group of kids who grow into adults who have children who bully. Sadly, it's intergenerational and intragenerational. So I grow older with the behaviour if no one helps me, and I am more likely to have children who engage in that behaviour. So quite serious if we don't address it. And of course, when we look at perpetration, they're about a little over 10%, so lower levels. Maybe we just have children who don't report it in Australia as much, as maybe it's considered more socially undesirable here, so we get lower levels. Who knows what the real levels of perpetration are? There's a lot of social normative stigma associated with admitting that you are bullying someone else, even though the questionnaires are very often explained to the children that they're anonymous, but lower than we see internationally. And as you can see, about 3.5% report cyberbullying perpetration. So a question that's kind of a point in time, and it's using meta-analyses to give us a really robust measure of how much is this occurring. And it's a lot. 1 in 4 children are reporting they're being bullied. So you throw these numbers up, but you think, how many in a classroom, how many children in a school, the children that we're caring for. So it's a serious issue, and we know it has some pretty serious effects over time if it's sustained, especially. And I'll come to those in a moment. But at this point, when we think about prevalence, what do we know about what's happening now? And there's really interesting data. I've just been fortunate to have a look at some data in New South Wales in the role that I'm in there. And we can see that, as you can see, face-to-face bullying is pretty stable. And those are US data, but in Australia, that's true also, that we've not seen a big change. It hasn't gone down. But it hasn't gone up either. It dipped, a very deliberate dip we saw in data that was being collected through COVID, because kids weren't spending time together face to face, and that had a real effect on children's reporting of bullying. And not surprisingly, cyberbullying went up during lockdowns and when kids were using more technology. And I think all of us expected that it would drop again once children were back at school and settled back into the routines. But in the data that I've seen in New South Wales, which is probably the most comprehensive that I've seen, cyberbullying has stayed up. So we haven't seen that drop in both reports of victimisation and perpetration. So it's something for us to be watching and trying to understand. Has more of the behaviour morphed online as children maybe have been exposed to it or used it? And when we look at the data around that, older data, we're always limited by when are people collecting this information. But this Modecchi study that I mentioned earlier on, that looked at all of those international studies together, that meta-analyses showed that 36%, and the word here is ever, so in their lifetime, have ever been bullied. And you saw those numbers I mentioned earlier on. Cyberbullying is less common, and obviously you can see here by the reported involvement of the target or perpetrator, but a really recent, this is, I guess, the part that I'd like you to focus on. So Kennedy's study, which was published in 2021, so it's again the most current international data we could get hold of, and it was meta-analyses again, so really robust. Found that cyberbullying victimisation is growing, and you can see the numbers they're showing from 1998 to 2017, still pre-COVID, even though he's reporting in 2021. But as I said, I've been fortunate to see data that were collected that haven't been published yet. So I can't report the source, I'm sorry, but I think we need to know that the cyberbullying is on the increase. And that there's lots of overlap here, and again, you may well be aware of this, but about 80% of children who report that they're face-to-face bullied will also report that they're being cyber-bullied. So it's just become another vehicle for bullying to be delivered, sort of same dog, different fleas, in terms of how children are being exposed to a sort of an additional, if it wasn't verbal and it wasn't a social exclusion and it wasn't physical bullying, it's not that children experience only one of those. It's usually a combination. And as I said, cyberbullying has become, if you are cyberbullied, there's 80% chance you're also being face-to-face bullied. So what does this mean for our practice? It means if we're doing a really good job with our face-to-face interventions, we are also reducing the likelihood of cyberbullying, because children who are cyberbullied are 80% of children who are cyberbullied are also being face-to-face bullied. So it's a good clue for us in terms of actions that we can take. And of course, Modecchi's meta-evaluation, which again, I'm using it because it's our best and most robust, found some correlations. Now, a correlation of 0.47 is really high. If something's correlated like that, there's something going on here. And this correlation was between cyber and traditional victimization, perpetration, and cyber and traditional victimization were also very highly correlated. So we've got a lot of data to say, if very good chance if a child's being cyberbullied, they're also being face-to-face bullied. It doesn't work the other way, quite the same. It is a chance that if you're being face-to-face bullied, you are also being cyberbullied. But there's a lot more face-to-face bullying going on than there is cyberbullying, as you've seen from the numbers. And we also know that students who bully others are also more likely to be targets themselves. And a child who is experiencing both perpetration and their bullying others has the worst. They typically have the worst mental health profile. So a group to really watch if they're engaging in that behaviour. So it's interesting to see how there is overlap between these groups. So when we think about all forms of bullying, and you'll note that I've got cyber here in parentheses, just to kind of emphasise that cyber is included when I'm talking about bullying here. I'm not just showing you the outcomes of cyberbullying in case my typing here is suggesting that. But just to give you, again, this has come from the studies that I've already talked to, the meta-analyses. There's a fair bit in this here to focus on, but when you look at the type of bullying, so if I'm being victimised regularly, these are the outcomes that have been most consistently shown in multiple studies over time. And if I'm involved in perpetration or victimisation, so a combination of the two, these outcomes here, aggression and violence later in life, drug and substance use, offending behaviour and dating violence, are much more likely to be the outcomes. So again, I'm sure there's no surprises here. It's just the robustness of this evidence. So when people think about, what should we be doing to support children's mental health, you couldn't possibly leave bullying out of the equation when you look at how much harm is associated with victimisation. And of course, a child who's being both victimised and engaging in bullying, for all of these outcomes for victimisation, they're all typically at higher rates. So serious issues that continue to be evident and certainly showed in multiple studies. So again, we could have confidence that what we're seeing here is something that's quite real. And when we pull that apart a little bit more to say, well, if they're the outcomes, what can we do to help predict whether we can reduce that or that these behaviours will increase? So what are the risk and protective factors that we know, again, from really robust evidence that will help us to work out how to target our interventions so that we bring precision to the ways that we address bullying over time? People often use that slogan, no data, no problem, because there's no solution. Because if you don't understand what's occurring, you can't intervene effectively. So having really good quality evidence helps us to understand what we should be doing to address this. So when we think about risk factors for all forms of bullying, including cyberbullying, there's a lot of information here, and I just pull it apart for you. First of all, these numbers that you see in the brackets here are how high this factor is. So if these numbers are higher, that's indicating that this risk factor, negative peer influence, is even more powerful than poor self-esteem and self-view. But both of them are very, very powerful risk factors for children to be involved, both as a target and a perpetrator. So to pull this apart, there are three categories of levels of involvement that I'm showing you here for bullying. The first are the kids who are being victimised, so the targets of bullying. And what are the risk factors that might increase the likelihood of a child being a target? So again, big studies, not surprisingly, a low peer status, and often children are deliberately targeted by perpetrators if they are lonely kids, because they're less likely to have a bystander uprising. Now, people don't really like them, so they're less likely to defend them and so on, which is incredibly sad to say out loud. But I'm sure you're not surprised. So, you thinking, what do we do about this? Well, the more we can connect children and build their relationships so they have multiple friendship groups, the less likely they are to become a target. So kids who aren't popular, working with them together, opening up the library at lunchtime, where sadly kids who are lonely tend to go. Two lonely kids might make friends. What are we doing in terms of social architecture to help kids build friendship groups and strengthen their ability to make friends? And that falls into the sort of social competence. If I'm not socially competent, I'm more likely to be a target. If I have some internalizing problems, I demonstrate levels of anxiety or worry, I'm more likely to be targeted. If I have poor self-esteem, if I'm in a school climate that is not positive and operating very poorly, difficult community context, and of course a home and family environment where perhaps there are adults who are modelling many of these other behaviours, that they are also lonely and not good at making friends and so on. You can see here by the predictors, the reason I included these numbers in here is you can see how different. Now, what would you target? And the numbers are telling you that's what you would target first. So if you look at the 0.35 and 0.30, you get a lot, you get 3 times the value. All of these should be addressed, but if you can't address them all, you would go for the ones that will give you the best value for money, I guess, might be a way of saying it. And similarly, when we look at children, young people who are perpetrating, what are risk factors for that? That they are having other cognition difficulties, such as poor empathy. They're more likely to have negative peer influences, perhaps peers around them who are encouraging that behaviour, or at least accepting it as normative. They might have externalizing problems, difficult community context, again, in an environment that might be enabling that behaviour. School climate, more likely to be male. Sadly, those data come up, and difficult home environments. So already here, you can see a factor that would help both children. So school climate is just jumping out of us to say, well, if we can get that right, it's a big predictor. It's not as big a predictor as being alone, but if we're in a school that's functioning well, where you can feel it in the school environment that it's committed to kids, that would be an example of how these data help us work out how we intervene. And then, not to spend too long on this slide, but for kids who are involved, as I described before, the kind of bully victim, they're both perpetrating and they're experiencing bullying. What puts children at risk of being in that category? Obviously, having peers around them, very similar to perpetration, poor self-esteem, low peer status again, poor social competence, similar things that you see in both the target and the perpetrator, not surprisingly. One jumping in here that you haven't seen before, poor academic performance, and it's at 0.3. So if we help children to learn better and we support their academic skills, we are also contributing to outcomes that relate to reducing their risk of being bullied. And again, difficult school climate appearing in all 3 of these categories as a way of addressing this. So what do you do with this information? Well, first up, we need to know what's going on in our schools and how are our children profiling. So this is effectively saying, but this is at a huge aggregated level, but you could do this in a school as well. What are the difficulties our children are experiencing, and what do we need to target? And information like this really helps us to bring precision, as I mentioned before. So to take all that lot of information, I'm sorry, at one slide, I kind of wanted to show it to you comparatively. When we look at the modifiable risk factors, I mean, you can't really change the community that you're living in. Maybe there can be some change. Families are obviously very difficult to support, and is it the school's job to do that? But what can we do? A difficult school climate, as I've already referred to, just jumps out at us. Supporting kids who are being negatively influenced by their peers, or the norms that are being established, normative expectations at school. Supporting kids who have low peer status, so improving their connection with other friends. Just think beautiful social and emotional learning programs which are helping children to build relationships and also helping them to regulate their emotions. They're more likely to have friends if they are better able to regulate, obviously. Supporting deficiencies in social competence and social problem solving, but to position that another way, this is how the authors wrote about it, is strengthening those 2 outcomes, and of course addressing internalizing and externalizing problems. And as I've already mentioned, children who experience both perpetration and victimization are at greatest risk. So they were risk factors. So protective factors, no, sometimes it's just the flip of those. But the 2 that just leap out of these meta-analyses, this is the Modecki work again, are a safe and positive school environment. Everything that we are doing to build an environment that children feel safe in, and its perception, as much as it is, all our schools are largely very safe. It's just how kids perceive it that is really important, and us building that positive school climate. And that's very much through relationships between staff and students, students and students, everything that we do cross age group to help children establish and build really positive relationships within the environment. And of course, the promotion of these skills, social emotional learning skills and capacities, which we all know well, and there's really lovely data to support how beneficial they are in reducing the likelihood of bullying in the context we're looking at now, but improving well-being. We are getting a lot of value from focusing on these outcomes. So the last part of my presentation is, so if we know the prevalence, we know that prevalence causes lots of harm, and we know what the risk factors are, what do we do about it? And so I'd just like to close with, what does this evidence tell us? And again, it's not rocket science, and again, it's lovely to have this affirmed. So the summaries from Modecki and other meta-analyses, large meta-analyses that have occurred, have shown that when we do intervene with bullying, it works better with younger kids. And that's good news for us, because the earlier we get in, the greater support we can provide over time. It works better with boys than with girls. Girls' behaviour is much more covert, so it's harder to get that change, but we'll talk about ways to address that in just a moment. US data shows that they work more effectively in homogenous school settings with less ethnic diversity. So this rings alarm bells for me, that if our interventions are only working in those environments, what are we not doing that is supporting those children who are often at greatest risk? So, this is past. This is reflecting on what's happened in the past and how effective what we've done has made a difference. So I'm going to talk to what might look a little bit different as we move forward. And they've also been more successful in higher SES schools. And again, often there's more resource and a different environment for that. So again, you can see the data I'm using here has come from 2 papers, one published last year and one published the year before, Gaffney's work and Hensom's, and some great work by Lee. Even though it's a bit old, the quality of the science is really good. So what I'm showing you here is what does and doesn't work to reduce bullying in the past. So when we look and reflect on what we've done in the past, what works is obviously the column I'd love to focus on. Whole school approaches just leap out at us. We cannot address this by only going through work in the classroom. Necessary, but not sufficient. And the more whole school our approaches are, obviously the more successful in the longer term. Really clear policies, really clear classroom rules, establishing routines, involving behaviour as curriculum. Versus just the thing we deal with when children are behaving badly, but actually setting the tone and engaging with children in appropriate ways to behave is critical, where there's consensus and student voice in that process. Obviously, teachers engaging and speaking to the behaviour about the standards of behaviour that they expect. It doesn't necessarily need to be a discussion about bullying, but it's a discussion about how we treat each other with respect and how to be friendly, how to be kind. Where we're constantly reinforcing that message of how critical that is in our school environment and the expectation that that's the behaviour that will occur. Obviously, quality classroom management makes a difference. Even though a lot of bullying happens outside the classroom, classroom management sets the tone for the behaviour within the school. And of course, involving peers, mentoring programs, peer leaders, not peer mediation. There is definitely, in fact, it should be listed on the side of what doesn't work. Peer mediation puts too much peer counselling, too much pressure on kids. It takes 6 years minimum to train as a counsellor. I'm not sure how we could have even thought that kids could counsel other kids in a school environment. But then just really quickly looking at where it's equivocal. Increased monitoring and reporting doesn't appear to have made any difference, and certainly on its own is very ineffective. Playground supervision is important, but its contribution is very small relative to these other issues that are here. And using school assemblies to deliver bullying information is not personal enough for kids. A part of an overall whole school approach, yes, it has contribution, but a small contribution relative to the things that are listed in the other column. So when we think about what we can do to prevent bullying, a lot of those strategies that you saw me list in the previous slide would be the things that we would have in place and perhaps some early intervention. But when things get messy and kids are engaged in bullying, and we need to then respond thoroughly, consistently and effectively to those behaviours, there is certainly evidence to show that punitive behaviours only are ineffective. that children here need to learn how to behave differently. It's not enough to just be punished or whatever the consequence is within a school environment. It's same as all behaviours. They work, the change is necessary through non-punitive, but elements where there are consequences, but where there is some restorative approaches. Now, I'm not talking about the restorative approach, which is being marketed as a form of action. I'm talking about any approach that helps kids build relationships again. As you can see here, there's good data to show that anything that is non-punitive but supportive in building relationships again after consequence, where there is discipline and student behaviour engaged, or where there's student conflict, sorts of actions that have been found to be most effective are things that support the target to address the situation. Support group method, which some people will know that technique. If you look it up on the internet, I'd be happy to talk to it if anyone wants to contact me. Shared method of concern I know is well used in schools, but a lot of these rely on empathy in the perpetrator, and a number of perpetrators that we have certainly studied, quite a significant number, often don't have empathy for their target. So when we use techniques that rely on drawing empathy out of the perpetrator, that might not be effective. So some of our ways to move forward is consider strategies like motivational interviewing, which gets to a child's motivation for their bullying and works with their motivation, rather than just trying to change how they feel about the target that they are harming through their bullying. And of course, these approaches work really well with really clear behavioural guidelines and management policies within the school. And as you saw earlier, an anti-bullying policy, or really clear expectations around behaviour, are critical. Now, I wouldn't be calling it a bullying policy. I would be calling it a behavioural expectations policy in our school. Here are the sorts of things that we would be addressing. But the data that I'm reporting on here was what has been done in schools. So Hall's work, I can't see the reference on this page, might be behind your and my picture in the corner there, Jack, but these were the things that were contained within bullying policies where schools were showing better outcomes than others. I'd argue that what we know now, and building on this understanding of these elements, are critical to setting a standard within the school environment, is that we start to think about the ways we want children to behave, what our expectations are, versus behaviour management, where it's all about suppression of behaviour. It's more about what do we want and what do we expect in a school environment, and setting standards, setting the bar for behaviour, because many kids don't know what it looks like. And if we only tell them what it doesn't look like, they're obviously not learning, which is the role of a school environment. So last but not least, school responses to bullying. Sorry, lost my Y there. Behaviour. How would we respond to that? If we have a child who is not reading well, would we stand them in the corner to think about better ways to read? And I use that metaphorically, standing in the corner, but often our discipline practices are just about giving a consequence to a child that they have behaved badly, without using learning and showing them how to behave better. So I'd argue we need to address this issue, and certainly the evidence is really clear, in the same way that we would address any other learning problem in a school. If a child can't read well, we would sit with them, we would scaffold them, we would show them better ways to read, and obviously behaviour needs to be addressed in that same way. The data also shows that teachers make an enormous difference to reducing bullying, their relationships with students, climate, things we know already, that teachers feel confident in that environment, how they feel about bullying and that they act on it, and what strategies they choose to intervene when it occurs. So yes, it's enormously important that we bring teachers along with us, and that they appreciate the reasons why they're doing the things that they're doing. The evidence is solid that without their full involvement, it diminishes the impact overall of bullying. So to close, I'd just love to summarise for you. If you are now thinking, all right, there's a lot of information there, what are the most important things that the evidence is suggesting we should be addressing? And this isn't a program. This is about practices. What are the practices that we need to build? And largely, these practices should be targeting those behaviours that are occurring in our school environment. Some of them are very general and others more specific. So most importantly, school climate. Cannot look past how we're establishing the climate in our school, how positive, what are the interactions. All of us, I'm sure, when we walk into a new school, sadly, within minutes, you can feel how a school is operating and everything they say and everything they do, the warmth that's in the environment. Does the school feel like it belongs to students? Does the front office feel like this lovely, warm place that's accepting of all cultures? All those actions that we have that typically makes up the cultural climate that we have within a school. Relationships, I am putting these in order in terms of what we understand in terms of these predictors. Obviously, relationships feed into culture or school climate, but all the effort that we put into building relationships is absolutely critical. But most importantly, reflecting on the evenness of how we build those relationships. If you ask a school to reflect on are they really caring about the students in their school? Are they knowing every student? They'll all say, yes, we are. And I'm sure they are working terribly hard. But when you look at which children are they building relationships with, there will always be some children who are getting a lot less attention than others. And there are lovely techniques like putting up the photographs of all the children in each of the year groups at different points and writing everything you know about these children that's positive, and have a look at who are the children that maybe we don't know as much about, so that we get that evenness and equity in the support that we provide to build relationships. Critically, we need to involve young people. And again, I know you know this is just this affirmation that there is buckets of evidence to show that when we get children involved in this, in the actions that we have in place by helping them to form policies, helping them to implement practices, obviously engaging them as older and younger children, the vertical organisational work that we do with older kids, working with younger kids, and most importantly, building their sense of belonging and connectedness. Engaging our parents, making them feel really welcome in the school environment, doing whatever we can to ensure that they are partnering with us to build all learning for their children, but particularly related to their behaviour, and giving them tips on actions they can take if they see their children, maybe sibling bullying and so on, so that they can apply and understand that process. Absolutely critical that we have explicit teaching of social emotional learning. There is a lot of discussion about, well, it's just the way we interact with kids, but the explicitness of it is critical. It's a skill. If I want to learn to play basketball, I've got to learn the skill. I've got to practice it in small game context, and then I've got to be able to take it to the big game. We need to do the same with our social emotional learning skills and practice as much as possible with as many opportunities. I mentioned before the importance of a safe school environment and how much it's about perception. In a school we were in, there was a burnt out bus carcass in the school, and we happened to be collecting data at the same time. And the kids talked about how unsafe they felt in their school, just in compared to previous data that we were collecting. The things that can change. The school was still very safe. It was just this terrible fire that had happened with the bus. So constantly checking in with kids to find out where they feel safe, mapping the school environment to see where are the green zones that they love going in, where are the red zones that make them feel uncomfortable, those hot spots, and doing whatever you can to change their perception of those areas, or maybe their reality too. And of course, building common understandings, using language that everybody understands in the school environment about whatever it is that, maybe it's just the term bullying is often needs to be well defined within a school environment, but using language related to social emotional learning and language that allows people to be able to understand and respond in similar ways. That consistency breeds clarity. Hotspots I've already talked about in terms of our physical environment, and of course how our school facilitates interactions with young people. So in the classroom, obviously the way we structure groups and so on, help kids to get along with other children, but also what do we offer in the break times? How do we position even seating in the school environment that enables children to be able to get along with others? I mentioned the example in the library. How do you help kids who are lonely come together, maybe putting out board games where they can play with each other to build that interaction. But when you think about all of these things together, and what should we be focusing on most of all to really, really make a difference? how we also respond to bullying is critical, and the actions that we take. I talked before about the restorative practices, but the most important issue is this critical finding that we have, that we need to know every student as deeply as we can. I obviously know their name, but also know things about them, so that we build that credit with them that we can draw down if they are behaving badly or they're experiencing difficulties. We've already established a trust that would enable them to talk to us and seek help as they would need to. Now, Jackie, I know I've talked a lot there, and I'm sorry. There's so to capture everything we know about bullying most recently into one piece of research in 45 minutes was a challenge, but thank you for letting me share that with everyone.
Donna, we are seriously honoured. You have crammed what would probably be a full day into a very short moment. And, you know, sometimes in our busy, busy world, this snapshot and this short moment that they have can sometimes be all that school's got. So I'm hoping that this recording will also be used for staff, maybe to share in things like staff meetings. And, you know, there will be an application for these very short, intense bringing together of decades of your work. And so, look, I am very appreciative, and I think we're all honoured to have had you spend that time in bringing this together. And the more recent studies reinforcing, you know, some of those big meta-analysis that have occurred internationally. I'd also just like to acknowledge the work of your Friendly Schools and Families initiative, because it is the only Australian whole school approach to comprehensively addressing bullying that takes in so many of these facets. And I know that a lot of the research that you've done over these last couple of decades has been trialing and testing the evidence that you've gained in practice out in our Australian schools. And it is a very large sample that's informed that work. So just putting that out to schools as well, that makes it a slightly easier approach for them if they're not sure where to start, to get a copy of that Friendly Schools and Families resource. So Donna, thank you. And as I said, we're honoured to have had this moment with you, and truly appreciative of what you've given us today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jackie.